In the quiet stillness of a faraway planet, where towering spires of crystalline rock reached toward an unfamiliar sky, an extraordinary bond was forged, one that would forever change the course of history. The people of this alien world, known for their fierce independence and unyielding traditions, had never known mercy. Their ways were ancient, their laws strict, and their pride unmatched. But none of it mattered when the enemy arrived. For generations, the people had lived in peace, untouchable and thriving under the protection of their vast and complex military. But that peace was shattered in the blink of an eye when a ruthless intergalactic warlord with his own army of merciless invaders descended upon their world. They came with fire and fury, intent on wiping out every trace of resistance, every flicker of hope. The people of this planet were strong, but their numbers were no match for the brutality of their aggressors. And just when all hope seemed lost, when their people had all but given up, a human appeared. At first, the alien leaders could hardly believe their eyes. A lone human, seemingly insignificant compared to the towering warriors they were accustomed to, had managed to infiltrate the enemy's ranks. Alone, he had not only survived but had also disrupted the invaders' entire operation. The people watched in awe as the human, with resourcefulness and bravery beyond comprehension, single-handedly turned the tide of the battle. Against all odds, he had won the impossible fight, rescuing the most important leaders of their civilization and ensuring their survival. The alien leader, a woman known for her wisdom and fierce determination, found herself in his debt. And yet, in their society, owing a life debt was not something to be taken lightly. It was a matter of honor and obligation that could not be dismissed. But what was the cost of saving an entire civilization? The question weighed heavily on her mind as she faced the human who had given everything to protect her people. As she stood before him, gratitude filled her heart, but so did a deep sense of responsibility. The traditions of her people dictated that such debts must be repaid, and in the ways of their world, there was no higher honor than to give one's daughters in marriage as a sign of that repayment. The human had saved her life, and in turn, she would offer him what she held most precious, her daughters. The decision was not one made lightly. In her culture, daughters were not simply gifts to be given away. They were warriors, leaders, and symbols of power. To give them away in marriage was a profound gesture, a move that carried great weight and significance. Yet, the bond between the human and the alien world had already been established. And in a moment of clarity, she realized that this human, so different from her people, held the key to their future, a future that might depend on the unique connection they had forged through sacrifice and bravery. The human, for his part, had never expected anything like this. He had come to this alien planet on a simple mission to help, to protect. But the moment the alien leader offered her daughters, he felt a mixture of confusion, awe, and honor. How could he accept such an offer? He wasn't from this world. His values were different. Yet, in the eyes of the woman who had saved his life, just as much as he had saved hers, he saw the sincerity and the weight of her actions. Her daughters were not what he expected. They were fierce, strong, and brilliant in their own right. They had inherited their mother's resilience and intelligence. And as he spent more time with them, getting to know each one, he realized that the choice wasn't just about duty, it was about something deeper. Something that neither side could have anticipated. But as the days passed, a quiet tension began to grow. The human's presence on this planet was a reminder of the debt that could never be fully repaid. The alien world, while grateful for his actions, had its own internal struggles. There were factions among their people who saw this alliance with humanity as a threat, something that could weaken their civilization. The traditions of their people had always been strict, and breaking them for an outsider was unthinkable to some. The daughters, too, were caught in a web of conflicting emotions. They were bound by the expectations of their people, and yet they had come to respect and admire the human who had saved them. Would they truly marry him? Would they follow the path laid before them? Or would they defy tradition for the sake of love, honor, and something more profound? The questions lingered in the air, unanswered, and the tension only grew as their bond with the human deepened. But there was another force at play, an enemy who had not forgotten the humbling defeat they had suffered at the hands of this human. They were regrouping, readying themselves for another attack, and this time they would not be caught off guard. The fragile peace between the alien world and the human race was about to be tested in ways no one could have predicted. As the story of this unusual alliance unfolded, a realization began to settle in. The battle was far from over. The stakes were higher than anyone could have imagined. What started as a story of gratitude and honor had become something far greater, an intergalactic struggle for survival, love, and the future of two very different worlds. And in the end, it was the human who would have to choose: honor the debt, or fight to protect the women and the world that had become his home. The choices made in the coming days would not only shape the fate of the alien civilization, but also the future of humankind. Would the human be able to bridge the gap between two worlds, uniting them in the face of an impending storm? Or would his presence and the promises made lead to the very destruction he had fought so hard to prevent? The tension was thick, and as the story continued to unfold, it became clear nothing was ever as simple as it seemed, and the sacrifices made would echo across the universe in ways no one could have anticipated. The question now was, who would survive the war for the future of both worlds? Would the human's extraordinary bravery be enough to save everything, or would it tear everything apart? The answer to that question would soon be revealed, and only time would tell how far the ripples of one man's actions could reach. The offer had been made, but it lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. The human, still trying to grasp the magnitude of what was unfolding, found himself caught between the weight of the alien leader's gift and the turmoil within his own heart. He had never sought the affection or the hand of royalty, nor had he ever imagined that his simple act of saving a life would lead him to a crossroads that could decide the fate of two worlds. His mission had always been clear: help, protect, survive. But now, standing before the woman who had saved him in return, his mission had become a matter of honor, duty, and uncharted emotions. Her daughters, each fierce in their own way, were as complex as the world they hailed from. The eldest, a formidable leader in her own right, wore her warrior's heart like a shield. Her eyes spoke of battles fought and won, but beneath them, the flicker of curiosity for the human was undeniable. The middle daughter, more reserved, yet highly intelligent, saw beyond the surface. She knew that her world was changing, but she wondered if the human was the answer or the spark for something deeper and darker. The youngest, brimming with ambition and dreams, sought something more than tradition could offer. She was torn between the security of what was expected and the freedom to carve her own path, one that might involve the human who had crossed the lines of their ancient world. As they spent more time together, the complexities of their situation only deepened. The human, though not a leader by nature, had earned a quiet respect from each of them. They had seen him fight alongside them, and in many ways, his presence had been a comfort during their darkest hours. And yet, each of them knew that his bond with their mother was a connection that could never be easily replicated. It was a debt, a life-altering debt, one that could not be repaid simply by words or actions. It required something far more profound, a sacrifice that would echo throughout their lives. For the alien world, these were uncharted waters. Their traditions dictated that gifts were sacred, that alliances came with an unspoken price. The idea of offering a daughter's hand in marriage as a repayment for a life saved was, in itself, revolutionary. Yet, there was no turning back now. The human had become a part of their history, whether they liked it or not. The question was not whether he would accept the offer, but how the consequences of that choice would ripple through their society. Tensions began to rise, not just within the family of the alien leader, but within the ranks of the planet's ruling council. Some saw the humans' actions as a sign of weakness, an indication that their people had grown soft, relying on an outsider to protect them. There were whispers in the dark corners of the city, calls for a return to the old ways, when strength and isolation had defined their way of life. How could they allow their civilization to be so indebted to one human? The question gnawed at them, eating away at the unity they had once felt. On the other hand, there were those who saw the humans' bravery as the only thing that had kept them from extinction. In the aftermath of the warlord's initial assault, the alien planet had been left in shambles. It was only because of the humans' unexpected intervention that they had begun to rebuild. His presence had brought hope, a spark of life into a world that had almost lost its will to fight. The daughter's bond with the human was another complication. They were not just figures in a political game. They were individuals, each with their own dreams and desires. The eldest daughter had spent much of her life training for a role she had been born into, a life of leadership and responsibility. She was not sure how to reconcile her feelings toward the human, a man who seemed so different from everything she had been raised to understand. Could she marry him, fulfilling her mother's debt while still honoring her heritage? The middle daughter, ever the thinker, questioned the very foundation of their traditions. She wondered if this marriage, if it were to happen, would be a true union or a political move, a forced alliance to settle a debt. Could she look past the role she was expected to play? Could she find a way to truly love someone who had entered her life so suddenly, someone who represented everything her world had once rejected? The youngest daughter, brimming with fire and curiosity, saw the human as an answer to her dreams. In him, she saw the possibility of something new, something beyond the rigid constraints of their world. Could she find freedom in him, or would she be bound by the chains of tradition? It was a question that plagued her heart, especially as she grew closer to him. The warmth of his words, the honesty in his eyes, could that be enough to overcome the centuries-old traditions that had ruled their people? Despite their different perspectives, there was one thing that bound them together: the fear of what would happen if they failed to honor the debt their mother had offered. They knew the price of such a failure betrayal would bring dishonor, not only to their family, but to the entire civilization. No matter how they felt, they had to move forward, even if it meant living in a world that no longer seemed as predictable or safe as it once had. And then, as if fate itself were challenging their already tenuous balance, the enemy reappeared. After months of silence, the warlord who had nearly destroyed their world returned, but this time with a new, more terrifying weapon, an army of genetically enhanced soldiers, each one stronger and faster than any they had faced before. The peace that had been carefully stitched together between the human and the alien world was now in jeopardy, and the fate of both civilizations rested on the fragile alliance that had been formed. The human, with his experience and ingenuity, became the pivotal figure in the coming struggle. As the enemy's forces grew closer, the daughters began to understand something that they had not fully grasped before. The human was not just a savior, he was a symbol of what their world had failed to realize. Human resilience, determination, and unity were unlike anything they had ever seen. And in that realization, they found a deeper respect for him. But with the impending battle on the horizon, everything was about to change. The human, the daughters, and their entire world would soon be forced to make decisions that would define the future, not just of their people, but of the galaxy itself. Would they remain true to their traditions, or would they follow the path laid before them by an outsider who had unknowingly become their savior? Would the choices made in these coming hours lead to peace, or would they spark a conflict that would tear everything apart? The skies over the alien world grew darker with every passing day. The rumors of the warlord's return were no longer whispers, they were a tangible threat. The peace that had once seemed so fragile now appeared to be on the verge of shattering completely. The human, once an outsider, had become an integral part of the alien world's defense. But as the enemy drew closer, a new fear began to settle in. Despite the humans' bravery and cunning, the threat they now faced was unlike anything they had ever encountered. This was no longer just about repaying a debt. The daughters, each wrestling with their own emotions, found themselves caught in a whirlwind of duty and desire. The eldest, ever the warrior, was ready to fight, but she knew that her bond with the human was complicating matters. She had been raised to see strength as the defining characteristic of leadership. Yet, in the human, she saw something else: an inner strength, an unwavering resolve to protect those he loved. As the battle loomed, she could not help but feel drawn to him. But would she be able to put her feelings aside and lead her people as she was meant to? The middle daughter, the strategist, had begun to see the human in a different light. She had always prided herself on her ability to see the bigger picture. But now, with the warlord's army threatening to descend upon them, the bigger picture was clouded. She understood the importance of honor and tradition. But the more she learned about the human's past, the more she realized that his presence was changing the very fabric of their society. Was he the hero they needed, or was he the symbol of something they had never been able to embrace change? The youngest daughter, brimming with energy and ambition, had come to a harsh realization of her own. She had wanted freedom, something beyond the constraints of her world. But in the human, she found herself confronting a truth she hadn't expected. Freedom wasn't something that could be found outside. It had to come from within. The human had already shown her that. But would she be willing to stand by him, even if it meant turning her back on everything she had been raised to believe? The tension within the family was palpable. Every conversation felt like a battle. The warlord's forces were moving faster than anyone had anticipated. Each day brought new reports of enemy encroachment, and every hour felt like a countdown to an inevitable confrontation. The human, despite his own fears, had no choice but to rise to the occasion. He had been thrown into a war that wasn't his, forced to fight for a world that had once been so foreign to him. And yet, with each passing day, he grew closer to understanding the people he was fighting for, especially the daughters, whose fates now seemed to be intertwined with his own. In the midst of this chaos, the alien leader, their mother, began to understand something that she had not fully grasped before. The debt she owed to the human could never truly be repaid with marriage. It was a debt of life, of sacrifice, of honor. But the true bond that had formed between them was something deeper. She had offered her daughters as a gesture of gratitude, but now she realized that it was not for her to decide their futures. The war that loomed on the horizon was not about her. It was about the future of their world, and whether or not they could evolve beyond their ancient traditions. The human, for his part, was aware of the weight of his presence. He had never intended to become the center of such a powerful decision. He had never wanted to be seen as a savior or a hero. But as the enemy drew nearer, he could not ignore the responsibility that had been thrust upon him. He had been fighting for survival since the moment he had arrived on this alien world. But now he realized that his actions would shape the destiny of an entire civilization. The warlord's army was not just an enemy to defeat. They were a reminder of everything the alien world had feared: the erosion of their power, the crumbling of their traditions. The human's presence had already begun to unsettle their way of life. But now, in the face of this new threat, they would have to decide: could they trust in the human's vision, in his ability to lead them to victory? Or would they fall back into their old ways, rejecting everything that had brought them this far? As the hours ticked away, the human found himself standing at the precipice of something far greater than he had ever imagined. His role was no longer just that of a protector. He had become a symbol of hope, a beacon for a future that was no longer certain. His actions, whether he realized it or not, had begun to shift the very foundation of the alien world's society. His relationship with the daughters, complicated as it was, had become a reflection of the broader struggle that was unfolding: a struggle for identity, for change, for survival. With the warlord's forces closing in, the moment of reckoning was fast approaching. The human, the daughters, and the entire civilization now stood at a crossroads. The war would determine more than just the fate of the battle. It would determine the future of their entire world. Would they choose to fight together, embracing the unknown that the human represented? Or would they turn away, clinging to their traditions at the cost of everything they had fought for? The tension was unbearable. The warlord's forces were only a day away from striking, and every hour seemed to stretch longer than the last. The human could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had never imagined that his actions would bring him to this point, that his choices would be the deciding factor in a conflict of this magnitude. And yet, there was no escaping the reality of the situation. He had become something he had never asked to be: a leader. As the sun began to set, casting a red glow over the alien world, the human and the daughters found themselves standing together at the edge of the battlefield. The moment had arrived. The world they had known was about to change forever, and in the silence before the storm, they could only wonder: would they be ready to face it? The warlord was coming. The future was uncertain. And as the first battle cry echoed through the air, they all knew that this was only the beginning. The first battle cry echoed like a thunderclap across the alien world, but it was not the battle itself that caused the real shock. As the human and the daughters stood together, watching the distant horizon darken with the advancing enemy forces, something unexpected happened. A deep tremor rattled the ground beneath them. At first, they thought it was just the power of the warlord's army marching forward. But the tremor grew stronger, more intense, as if the earth itself were protesting what was about to happen. The human instinctively reached for the daughters, his protective instincts flaring, but before he could say a word, the sky above them split open with a deafening roar. A bright, unnatural light poured from the rift in the atmosphere, casting eerie shadows over the battlefield. The ground shook violently, and the sound of explosions filled the air, far off in the distance. The alien sky was no longer their ally. It had become a harbinger of doom. "What is happening?" one of the daughters whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos that was unfolding. Fear twisted her features, but there was something else beneath it, curiosity, perhaps even a sense of disbelief. They had all faced danger before, but this was unlike anything they had ever encountered. "I don't know," the human replied, his voice grim as he surveyed the strange light from above. He had faced death countless times, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer magnitude of this. It was as though the universe itself was conspiring against them. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the light dissipated. The ground stopped shaking, and the sounds of distant explosions faded. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had paused, holding its breath. But the peace was short-lived. Out of the rift, something began to emerge, something that was neither human nor alien, but a strange hybrid. A towering figure, armored in a sleek, shimmering suit that pulsed with an eerie energy, appeared in the sky. The creature floated above them, its presence a mixture of grace and terror. It moved as though it were part of the wind itself, its body seemingly weightless. The warlord's forces halted, confused and disoriented by the sight. "Who is that?" one of the daughters asked, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and fear. The human's mind raced. He had seen many things in his life, but this was beyond anything he had ever imagined. The creature above them was not from this world. It wasn't even from their universe, not in the way they understood. This was something far older, far more powerful than anything they had ever faced. As the figure descended, the warlord's forces seemed to shrink back, as if in fear of the alien presence. But the human could see the glint of greed in the eyes of the warlord's soldiers. They were not afraid, not entirely. Instead, they seemed to recognize the power of the creature, and with it, the opportunity it presented. The figure landed softly on the ground before them. Its armor shimmered with a strange light, and when it spoke, the voice was a blend of many languages, alien, human, and something far more ancient. It wasn't a voice that could be understood, not fully, but it carried with it a weight of authority, a power that commanded respect, even fear. "You have awakened something you do not understand," the figure said. Its voice echoed in their minds, as much as it did in the air, sending a chill down the spine of every living being on the battlefield. "The warlord is but a tool. The true enemy is much older, much more dangerous." The human and the daughters exchanged confused glances, but the figure continued. "The rift you saw is not an anomaly. It is the opening of a path, one that leads to a war far beyond your understanding. You are not fighting for your world. You are fighting for something far greater." The weight of the figure's words settled heavily on the human's shoulders. What did this mean? He had come to this world to protect them, to fight for their survival. But now, it seemed as if there was something more at play, something that threatened not only their world, but the entire universe. The warlord's forces, who had been ready to launch an all-out assault, now seemed to hesitate. They were no longer sure who their true enemy was. Was it the human and his newfound allies? Or was it the creature before them, the one that had come from the rift? The human stepped forward, his mind racing. He knew this was the moment that would decide everything. Whatever this creature was, It was now part of the equation, and he would have to figure out how to deal with it. If the warlord's army couldn't be controlled, and if this new enemy was even more powerful, what chance did they have? "We didn't ask for this," the human called out to the creature, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "We didn't ask to be dragged into some cosmic war. We only wanted to protect our home. But if this is the fight we have to face, then we'll fight. We've faced worse before. We'll face whatever comes next." The creature's glowing eyes locked onto the human. For a long moment, there was silence, heavy, oppressive. Then the figure spoke again, its tone dark and filled with a sense of inevitability. "Very well," it said. "But know this, even you cannot stop what is coming. You may fight for your world, but in the end, you are nothing but pawns in a game you do not understand. And the cost of this game is far greater than you can imagine." The ground shook again, and the rift in the sky began to grow wider, a massive vortex opening above them. The human felt a surge of dread. This was not just the beginning of a battle. This was the beginning of something far larger, something that could change the course of everything. They had been thrust into the middle of a war, but now they were facing an enemy whose true power was beyond comprehension. The human realized then that no matter how strong they were, they could never have prepared for this. The daughters, standing close beside him, sensed the same weight. This wasn't just about defending their home anymore. This was about survival on a scale they could never have imagined. With the enemy approaching, both from the rift above and from the warlord's army below, they knew that everything they had fought for was at risk. The true test was just beginning, and they were about to face it together. The rift above them began to churn violently, the darkness within it swirling like a storm. The figure, still hovering silently in the air, seemed to take in the chaos around it with a detached, almost calculating gaze. Its words echoed in the human's mind, lingering like an ominous warning. Yet, despite the fear gnawing at him, the human felt a surge of determination rise within him. They weren't just going to stand there, helpless. This was their world, their fight, and they would not be pawns in some cosmic game. They had faced countless enemies before, and they would face this one too. The ground beneath them trembled once again, louder this time. The warlord's forces, as well as the strange hybrid creatures, mysterious allies from the rift, seemed to react with equal parts hesitation and aggression. No one knew how to proceed, but the tension was palpable, crackling in the air like an impending lightning strike. This was the moment where everything would change, the moment that would either destroy or save them all. The humans stepped forward, their posture defiant, their hand resting on the weapon that had carried them through so many battles. "We've survived worse. And we will survive this too," the human said, his voice steady but carrying an underlying urgency. His eyes flicked to the daughters, each of them standing tall, their expressions filled with resolve despite the overwhelming odds. Without warning, the alien forces launched forward. The warlord's soldiers charged first, a ruthless tide of weaponry and advanced technology. But the human wasn't about to back down. The air thickened with the hum of energy blasts and the roar of alien weaponry as they fired upon one another, the battlefield descending into chaos. The creature in the sky descended faster than the human could react, its form becoming more solid, more substantial, its armored figure creating a vortex of destruction as it collided with the ground. But then, something unexpected happened. The human's weapon suddenly pulsed with an unfamiliar energy, a surge of power unlike anything he had ever felt. It was as if the very fabric of the battlefield had been altered, distorted by the very forces they were now fighting against. The daughters, recognizing the change in their surroundings, glanced at the human and then at each other. They understood now. This was it. This was their moment. With a synchronized movement, they unleashed their own weapons, their power combining with that of the humans in a unified blast of light that shot straight into the rift above. The rift trembled violently, its darkness convulsing in response to the attack. The figure above them, the mysterious entity that had seemed so untouchable, shuddered, its entire form flickering for just a second. And then, in a moment that stretched across eternity, everything stopped. The battlefield froze in place, time itself pausing as the force of the attack collided with the rift. The human's heart pounded in his chest as he stood breathless. Was it over? Did they win? His gaze locked on the daughters, their eyes filled with the same question. The world was still. The chaos was gone. But as they took in the silence, something began to shift. The rift above them began to collapse, its edges dissolving like sand in the wind. The dark sky cleared, revealing the stars above them, serene and untouched. But then, the unexpected twist came. From within the rift, a figure emerged, one, not like the towering, armored creature they had seen earlier, but something far more familiar, far more terrifying. It was another human, but not just any human. This one had the same markings, the same energy, the same overwhelming power as the one who had fought beside them. It was the human's twin. Shock rippled through the battlefield as the human's twin landed beside him, their eyes locking. The resemblance was uncanny, except for the cold, calculating look in the twin's eyes. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" The twin's voice was a low, almost mocking tone. This wasn't just a war. It was a test, a way to see how far you'd go. The human's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean? What test?" The twin smiled grimly. "A test to see who was worthy, to see who could rise above the rest. You've passed, but now you must decide what to do with the power you've unlocked." The daughters gasped, taking a step back as the realization hit them. The rift, the warlord, the strange creature, they had all been part of a much larger plan, one that neither they nor the human could have anticipated. The stakes had never been about a single world, a single battle. It was about something far greater, something that spanned across galaxies, across time itself. You're part of this," the human asked, the words barely making sense as they left his mouth. His twin's smile only deepened, a sinister gleam in their eyes. "It's not just me," the twin replied cryptically. "It's a whole network. We've been watching, guiding, testing. And now you've reached the point of no return." The human's mind raced. Everything he had fought for the lives of the daughters, the survival of their world, had been manipulated from the start. They weren't just fighting for their survival. They had been part of a much larger game, one that was still unfolding before their eyes. And now they had to make a choice. Stand with the universe they had known, or join something far greater. But there was no going back. The moment they crossed the threshold, they would no longer be the same. The human felt a rising tide of conflict within him, torn between what he had always known and the terrifying unknown that lay ahead. The daughters, standing at his side, sensed his inner turmoil. They had always trusted him, followed his lead. But now, they too would have to decide. What was the right path? What was the cost of power, and what would they sacrifice to protect their world? As the twins' presence loomed large, the rift's remnants flickered, pulsing with new energy. The moment of truth had arrived. The fate of everything rested on their next move. But with the twins' haunting words still echoing in the human's mind, it was clear the battle was far from over. It had only just begun. The air was still, a rare calmness after the whirlwind of events that had just unfolded. The sky, once painted with chaos and streaks of fiery light, now held a soft amber hue, signaling the dawn of a new day. For a moment, it felt as if the universe had collectively exhaled, releasing the tension that had gripped it tightly for so long. Amara stood at the edge of the cliff, her hands trembling slightly as she gazed out at the horizon. The weight of her decisions lingered heavily on her shoulders, but there was also a sense of relief. She had faced her greatest fears, confronted the darkness that had threatened to consume her world, and had emerged on the other side. Behind her, the remnants of the rebellion gathered, their faces a mix of exhaustion and hope. Each of them bore scars, some visible, others hidden deep within, but they were alive, and they were together. "Is it really over?" Kieran's voice broke the silence, his tone cautious, almost disbelieving. He approached Amara slowly, his steps deliberate. The once stoic warrior now looked vulnerable, his armor dented and his eyes wary. Amara turned to him, her lips curling into a faint smile. "I think it is," she replied softly. "At least, for now. The darkness has been driven back, and the balance restored, but the scars it left behind will take time to heal." Kieran nodded, his gaze shifting to the others who were beginning to tend to the wounded and collect their fallen comrades. The cost of their victory was steep, but the unity they had forged would be the foundation of their future. "We'll rebuild," he said, determination returning to his voice. "Not just the cities and villages, but the trust and hope that were shattered. Together, we'll make sure this never happens again." As the sun continued its ascent, casting golden rays over the land, the group began to move with purpose. Supplies were gathered, and plans were made to return to the nearby settlement where survivors waited. The once fragmented communities had come together in the final battle, and now they would remain united in the aftermath. Amara found herself walking among the people, offering words of comfort and encouragement. She paused when she saw a young girl sitting alone on a fallen log, clutching a small, tattered doll. The girl's face was streaked with dirt and tears, her expression one of quiet grief. Kneeling beside her, Amara gently placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "What's your name?" she asked softly. "Leela," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "Leela, you're very brave," Amara said, her tone warm and reassuring. "I know you've been through so much, but you're not alone. We're all here for you." Leela looked up at Amara, her eyes wide and filled with a glimmer of hope. She nodded slowly, clutching the doll even tighter. Amara stayed with her for a few moments longer before rising to her feet and rejoining the others. As the day wore on, the group reached the settlement where they were met with cheers and tears of relief. Families were reunited, and stories of bravery and sacrifice were shared. The once battered community began to take its first steps toward healing, drawing strength from the bonds they had formed in their darkest hour. Amara stood near the center of the settlement, watching as life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Alora, the wise elder who had guided them through many challenges. "You've done well, child," Alora said, her voice filled with pride. "But your journey is far from over. The world will always need protectors, those who are willing to stand against the darkness. Amara nodded, understanding the truth in Alara's words. "I'll be ready," she replied. "But for now, I think we all need a moment to breathe, to remember why we fight." Alora smiled, her eyes twinkling with wisdom. "Indeed. Take this time to heal and to cherish the peace you fought so hard to achieve." As night fell, the settlement was alive with the sounds of laughter and music. A makeshift celebration had been organized, a way to honor those they had lost and to embrace the future that lay ahead. Amara sat by the fire, surrounded by her friends and allies. Kieran raised a cup, his voice booming as he proposed a toast. "To unity," he declared, "to hope, and to a future where we stand together, no matter what challenges come our way." The group raised their cups in unison, their spirits lifted by the promise of a new beginning. As the fire crackled and the stars shimmered above, Amara allowed herself to smile, truly and deeply. She knew there would be more battles to fight, more struggles to endure, but for now, she was content to live in the moment, surrounded by those who had become her family. The journey had been long and arduous, filled with pain and loss, but it had also been a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Together, they had proven that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, hope could prevail. And as the first light of dawn illuminated the horizon once more, it carried with it the promise of a brighter tomorrow.